أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم اللهم صل على محمد وآل Muhammad. Assalamu alaikum everyone, and welcome to episode 5 of the Poets of the Household podcast, where we discuss and explore different topics of poetry and what it means to us in relation to our Holy Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and his holy household alayhimus salam. And as always, I am joined by my co-host, brother Naqi Rizvi. Naqi, how you doing, brother?
Alhamdulillah, doing great. Autumn is in full swing in Toronto, one of my favorite seasons. So definitely in a good mood.
Favorite seasons, eh? Okay, it's a little chilly, so you are Canadian after all. So I guess I don't know what to say about that. Anyways, um, and today, I know I say this every episode, but it's just true every single time. Today is also another very special episode. As you know, in this podcast, we usually have poets come on and they discuss their journey and they discuss different poetic styles and how English poetry can grow, how we can grow the culture, etc., especially surrounding the Ahlul Bayt. But today will be different. And what we mean by that is we wanted to bring another perspective when it comes to poetry, specifically on how it ties into our religion as a whole, specifically around the Ahlul Bayt, of course. And for that, alhamdulillah, we are honored and privileged to have our guest today, none other than Moulana Syed Asad Jafri. Syed Asad is someone who I'm sure you are all are familiar with, mashallah. A scholar who studied in the Hawza of Qum and speaks all over the world throughout the year, giving lectures and seminars, and of course leaves his mark with every community that he visits. And he is currently the religious director at Asadiq Islamic School in Toronto, and is currently pursuing his master's in Islamic studies. So without further ado, Moulana Syed Asad Jafri, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and thank you so much for being with us here today.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you for having me. I'm very excited to discuss this topic, inshallah, and looking forward to your questions and the back and forth dialogue, inshallah.
Inshallah. Again, thank you for being with us today. So let's start off with everything that we base our religion on when it comes to Quran and Hadith. That's the basis of our deen. So in particularly when it comes to poetry in our religion, specifically surrounding the Ahlul Bayt, what kind of Quranic ayats or any hadith you can share with us and our audience when it comes to poetry?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen wa bihi nasta'een wa huwa khairun nasirin wa mu'een. So we know that every subject, every topic, there's a place in the deen for that topic. And specifically poetry, really we have to go a little bit back, and I'll try not to be too long-winded, but there is a rich history when it comes to poetry, and specifically the Arabian Peninsula, even pre-Islamic in the Jahiliyyah era. The Arabs of those times, the nomadic Arabic tribes, they would use poetry not just as an expression or an avenue, let's say, or a hobby, but sometimes even to express enmity towards another tribe, or to honor another tribe, eulogize another tribe, let's say. Even, let's say, to find faults in another individual would all be wrapped in a poem or some sort of presentation that had poetic influence in it. And it's very well known that, they would have contests in Arabia pre-Islam, and where the winner of that contest would have his presentation, his writing, let's say, on the wall of the Kaaba for 1 year for the tribes that would go in and out, and it was a high traffic zone. As you know, Mecca was the hub, one of the hubs of not only worshiping idols at the Kaaba, but also trade and selling and buying for idols. So there'd be caravans going in and out of Mecca, and so this individual who would win this contest had the honor, really, according to him, to have his poem sort of displayed there on the Kaaba. And that's precisely why the miracle of the Quran came about. It was a miracle that was first and foremost based on the fasahat and the balaghat of the language, because literacy and the idea of poetry was so rampant and so present in that time. And remember, we understand the nature of miracles in Islam as that nature that is relevant and prevalent in that society. For example, Nabi Musa's asa and his cane was given to him because magic was prevalent back then. Nabi Isa's ability to cure the sick and raise the dead, because medicine was prevalent. This Quranic text, this narration, these revelations, these ayat and these verses was given to the Holy Prophet partly because literacy and poetry was relevant and prevalent at that time. And so that's the first sort of portion of it. And then when you get into the idea of some of the Ahlul Bayt and their advice sometimes, I'll give you just sort of a couple examples if you don't mind. Names that sometimes we think belong to a different context in Islam actually were, very, very effective poets of their time. One name that comes up constantly, one of the more famous poets that we had, is Kumail ibn Ziyad, the very famous Sahabi of Imam Ali, that is, Sahib al-Du'a Kumail, meaning he was the one that this dua was named after. He would write poetry to the point where it would, of course, praise the Ahlul Bayt. So remember, back then now, and specifically history picks up this portion post-Saqifa, where there really was a test of someone's ideology and their aqidah. And sometimes people like Kumail ibn Ziyad al-Asadi, he would actually write poetry, and in that poem, he would declare his aqidah or declare his allegiance, let's say, to Amir al-Mu'mineen. And that's why when you look at historically, many of the Bani Abbasids and Bani Umayyads, they would punish these poets, imprison them, sometimes outright kill them, only based on the fact that they would elevate the Ahlul Bayt to a status and then present that for the crowds in the form of their poetry. And that's why we have in our hadith, for example, Imam Sadiq alayhi salam is quoted as saying, teach your children, for example, I have it here, the poem or the poems of someone called Abdi. Abdi was a close companion of Imam Sadiq. Through that, he says, through this poems or through this poetry, your children will now understand the religion of God, he says.
Wow.
Okay? So, these are poets that existed during the Imams' times, and they would be avenues of knowledge that the Imams would pick up. So you can tell how deep rooted and how intrinsic it was in the culture of the Arabs, this idea of poetry. But again, we're not talking about just a hobby. Somebody had a khayal and a thought, and of course they wrote it. This was sometimes, a definition of Iman in Islam, a mu'min and a Muslim, an enemy of the Ahlul Bayt, a Shia or follower of the Ahlul Bayt, all based on their writings. And so we have countless hadiths to talk about the idea that the Imams would say, go to that poet and learn the deen from this poet, right? So those things exist, yeah.
Amazing.
Now, in terms of the Quran, if I can just touch a little bit about that.
Please.
Interesting that the last few verses of Surah Shu'ara, Shu'ara, of course, poets as is translated in Arabic, the 26th chapter of the Quran. It's a very lengthy surah, 220 some odd verses, but very short ones nonetheless. The last 5 or 6 are very interesting. And I want to very briefly discuss that because I'll use that as a base for a number of my other discussions later on in this program. There was a claim by the poets of that time. Remember, those poets didn't write about God, didn't write about any sort of goodness. They wrote about things that were sort of fuzuli, as you say. Things were a little bit careless, carefree, useless, didn't have a purpose behind them, right? They can't be compared to the Kumail ibn Ziyads of the world. Right. And their claim to fame was that, look, Muhammad, like us, is a poet, and his poetry are these verses of the Quran. And that's where these verses pick up. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala now says, look, let's be careful. Don't place my Muhammad or my Rasul or my Habib in the same category as these poets. Right. And then he goes on to describe how these poets are. And with your permission, I'll sort of recite verbatim some of these verses. They're very quick, but it's very interesting to note how the Quran describes these poems, these poets, and then of course, you know, the category by which they have. So he says, first of all, you know, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, these are the poets who people who go astray, they follow these poets. Ghawun are those people who are the opposite of those who are the mutadayyin or the muttaqin or the muhtadin, the ones who are guided. Ghawun are those who are the opposite of those who are guided. So they're astray. These are those group of people that follow these poets everywhere they go. Now, who are they? Do you not see, the Quran says? Very interesting now, the way this verse number 225 of Surah Shu'ara, do you not see that they wander about bewildered in every valley? These are poets where those who are misguided follow them, they idolize them, they worship them. Okay? And then very interesting, the Quran says they are who? يَقُولُونَ مَا لَا يَفْعَلُونَ. They say that which they do not do.
Right.
Now, what does it mean that they wander around the valley? Does that mean they're walking around without any purpose? They're going in circles, this and that? No. Allama Tabatabai has a very interesting tafsir of this verse. He says that their khayal and their thoughts wander around aimlessly. They write about things that are useless, or God forbid, they bring truth to those things that are innately false. They elevate those things that have been degraded by God. And then, of course, they speak about this lifestyle that they themselves don't practice. And then the very last verse of this Surah Shu'ara, Allah says, poets in general are like this, except for a certain few. Who are they? إِلَّا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَعَمَلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ وَذَكَرُوا اللَّهَ كَثِيرًا. Except for the ones who have iman, they perform good acts, and they remember Allah continuously. Kathiran, akthariyat. Majority of their time they are mashqul, they are busy in the dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So again, Allah is not against the idea of poetry or poets, but it should be an avenue where your sense of tawheed, your iman, your faith, your aqidah should elevate as you're writing this poetry. Otherwise, you become like those poets where the faithless follow you, you become hypocritical, right? And it's important that we understand a little bit of the Quranic aspect to that.
Jazakallah. MashaAllah.
I guess following that, the last point that you made around the advice, the advice that is given at the end of Surah Al-Shu'ara, are there any like boundaries and limitations that we should consider while writing poetry, especially poetry for the Ahlul Bayt? And then like also the opposite of that question, what freedoms or leeway do we have for creative thought and imagination when it comes to writing for either the Fadail or the Masaib of the Ahlul Bayt? I would love to get your thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, it's a beautiful question, Brother Naqi, and I really appreciate this question because I think this is a little bit of the crux of the issue, either good or bad. And I'll start out with a quick story in my days in the house in Qom. I remember there were things in that culture, in the Persian culture, that were a little bit ajib to me. They're a little bit strange to me, only because I come from a Pakistani background. So one of the things is really outside the Haram Abi Masamai Qom, right across the street, they have these shops there. And one was a rug shop, a shop that just kind of sold rugs and small little carpets. And during Muharram, I remember they would hang these carpets that had the image of Imam Hussein, actually his face on them. And sometimes in different moments on the day of Ashura. So I remember one rug that really caught my eye was him holding, Ali Asghar in his arms with the arrow in his neck. And eventually I had the courage to ask one of my Iranian scholars that, Shara'an, is this allowed? Like, they're drawing the picture of the Imam. I mean, it's not like there's a nur, there's eyes, an eyebrow, a nose, everything, you name it.
Right.
And he says, look, this is the khayal and this is the image of the artist. And that license is given to him so long as there's no sort of, disrespect or there's no sort of lowering or degradation of the Imam, of course. But it's interesting how much of a license that artist was given, where, in our culture, of course, it's, almost blasphemous to have that type of detail
Frowned upon, yeah.
It's frowned upon. Of course, it's discouraged. Now, again, not based on the deen, just sort of culturally speaking.
Right.
So it really shows me that the deen does give you a license that's creative to a wide aspect. Where the red lines are, and again, I go back to these verses, they speak volumes, especially for you two who write poetry, mashallah, very beautifully on a regular basis, is that we're not going to play with the sharia of Allah. We're not going to make those things that Allah has frowned upon elevated. We're not going to bring truth to those things that are innately false and that have been prescribed to be false. So whether that, and again, how you describe certain events that are real, that license is given to you. But like I said, bringing truth to a falsehood, elevating an area that has been, for example, cursed upon by the Ahlul Bayt, those things now become red flags and red lines. They say khatte girmiz in Farsi, that really strong red line that you don't cross into that. It can't be that, for example, a group of people, for example, and so it's a common example. If you don't mind, I'll use it. A group that would elevate Imam Ali to the level of divinity, that would claim him to be God, and that's a group that, of course, Imam Ali would curse and would summon to the punishment of Allah. How can you sit there and do shirk, and with me of all people, where I'm inviting you towards Tawheed? You've seen me on the musalla and the mihrab. You've seen me crying to my Lord. And yet sometimes we think in the fada'il and the distinction and in the elevation of Imam Ali, we sort of, we side with that group, or we understand where they come from. And even when we start to play with words sometimes, we have to be a little bit careful to not even sort of enter that arena where maybe people might be misunderstood, or even a soft spot for a group that Imam Ali now has essentially said, look, if you continue this way, you're going down a path of damnation, right? So those are things. And then, of course, creating a false narrative, outright, lies and historical inaccuracies, just because, it fit well in that verse. Remember, in our culture, and I'll expand it to the Arab, the Persians, and the Urdu culture. These are three cultures where a lot of our individuals, they would learn from the poets. Like a lot of what they understood from the deen was from these poets, to the point where they would quote these poems in an intellectual debate. That so-and-so poet had said this. Whereas, the alim is quoting books and volumes and authors and ulama and scholars. They're saying, yeah, but so-and-so poet said this, so-and-so poet said this, right? So when you understand the gravity of the idea that, it's huge. People are learning from this. Like, people are actually, they're shaping their knowledge of Islam through these poems. It's not just about fitting it in a certain rhythm, or making sure that this rhymes with that second stanza, or whatever your rhythm is. It's a responsibility, right? I mean, you become a muballigh of the deen when you're up there on the mic now praising the Ahlul Bayt, talking about Imam Hussein's musibah, for example, and people now take it as literally as wahy and revelation sometimes,
Right.
not just creative license. So, to answer your question, there is a lot of license you have creativity, but we're not going to, as the Quran says, we're not going to be individuals who bring truth to those things that are outwardly and innately false inside of us.
Right. Mashallah. Okay. That's a very important point. And before I get to my next question, like, for example, like, just for clarity purposes, like, we've heard, like we say in our language, nohas, or in Arab, in the Arab world, they say latmiya. Like, we've heard where conversations take place between one person to the other. Like, for example,
Correct.
there's a famous noha that we've heard, of a conversation between Bibi Sakina or Sayyid Ruqayya and Imam Hussein alayhi salam Ashur, before, he's gonna pass away the next day, or attain shahada the next day on the day of Ashura. Like, so are those kind of things okay in your estimation, as long as they're not crossing bounds, or are you talking about like creating brand new events that didn't occur?
Yeah, so I think the latter. Like, we're creating brand new events. We are actually creating people that weren't there. We are, introducing new characters in the story, for example. But again, as long as, and even as a reciter myself, sometimes, you know, I will say myself that my heart tells me that this is what happened.
Right.
And now I try to be conscious saying I haven't read this, but it's not far-fetched that a daughter and a father would have this connection, for
Right.
example.
Right.
That a 4-year-old, a typical 4-year-old, you know, about to lose her father would say this, for example. So
Right.
as long as the poet is clear in understanding that, and again, the audience also has to realize that that is a creative freedom, a creative license that has been granted to a poet just sheerly by that profession or that hobby or the act. You know, that sort of wiggle room is there. Again, as long as there's no disrespect, of course.
Yeah.
And again, even that disrespect, again, it's going to be long-winded, but even that is subjective, right? Certain cultures have, you know, a very subjective or a long range in terms of what's considered to be disrespect. You take the day of Ashura, for example, a 1 hour maqtal by our Arab speakers is again frowned upon, seen as blasphemy in our Urdu culture, right?
Mm.
We recite a 15-20 minute maqtal on the day of Ashura. Anything longer, and there are some people that would see that as disrespect to Imam Hussein. And during Fatimiyya, a lot of things we don't recite in the Masayib Sayyid Fatima, only
Right.
because it's considered to be tawheen or a lowering of her level. So I mean, even those levels, you know, in terms of the vastness of the what's considered to be disrespect is vastly different between cultures.
Right. And I think we're like, we know that when we hear something, it takes it back, kind of like, okay, you know what, we might be crossing a line here, and some things that fill our heart, and that might
Yeah.
be okay. So I think like we as grown adults are in a position to kind of know where that distinction is. So
Yeah,
you
I
know, I
just
think
wish the you know, poets would understand the effect of their words. You know,
yeah,
as much as you know, we're in an era of awareness and in a aware of era of information. There are still some people who really take the poet's word as gospel, as everything, as you know, you know. And if the alim reads something, sometimes I'm saying, if the alim reads something different from what they've heard in a marsiya or a salam or a noha or a
mhm,
qasida, they'll challenge the alim before they'll sit there and say, wait a second, that's a poet. That's a poet who wrote this. This is the
right.
alim of X amount of years who wrote this, right? So
Right, right, yeah, and then that's important. That's a probably good segue to our next question here. And you know, in your opening point, you mentioned, you know, Hazrat Kumail ibn Ziyad and how poets were revered in history, and you know how it's very very important to make that distinction between poets who have iman compared to who don't. So you know, I kind of wanted to ask you a question in regards to the history of poets that have gone through during the times of Ahlul Bayt, and if you can mention any sort of events in history where the imams have encouraged people to write or recite poetry, or any events where you know they actually had a poet recite poetry in front of them to kind of, you know, understand the status of a poet or understand what they mean to the society.
yeah, it's a good question, and there are many moments. You know, obviously, what comes to mind to everybody is after the event of Ashura, all the imams afterwards would make sure that the best poet of the time would come and recite, you know, this poetry on Imam Hussein's Musiba. I've oftentimes mentioned this on the member, even the concept of marthia and this idea of salam that we have, where an individual recites something up there. If you understood the language, they're telling a story up there, right? It's a historical narration of the events. Sometimes it's an entire maqtal of Imam Hussein's Musa'ib done in poetry, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know, and there are people who have done, you know, sharas of Nahj al-Balagha and Sahifa in a poetry form, for example. One thing that really stood out to me in my research for today's podcast, it really was incredible. One of the very first poets we have, and again, post Saqifa, in that very tense, chaotic era in Medina, around the days of Fatimiyya, was actually a woman. And,
Mm.
you know, she's known as one of the first women or people even to recite poetry in defending the rights of Amir al-Mu'mineen. Fresh after Saqifa now, you know, weeks after Ghadir. And I just want to, you know, it literally 4 lines in English that she recites. And this is something that is brought to us by Imam Sadiq that again is he asked the poets, include these lines inside your poetry. And again, I want you to understanding, of course, the
Bismillah.
context and the era that she wrote it in.
Mm,
Her name is Masta, her name was.
mm,
And she writes this, and she addresses the Holy Prophet. So history says that she stands in front of the grave of Rasulullah and she recites her poem. That's a
wow.
very high traffic public area,
Yeah,
doing it on purpose, ensuring everyone around her hears her.
right.
It was uncommon, of course, back then for a woman to recite any sort of poetry like this, of all places, in front of the grave of Rasulullah. And she says, after you, meaning after you, Ya Rasulullah,
Mm-hmm.
an event and differences have occurred that would never happen if you were present.
Mm,
We lost you, she says, just as the soil would lose water. Your community is going astray. Be witness, she says, and neglect not the ones who are truthful.
mm,
Spoke volumes,
mm,
especially at a time where people were very quiet. Silent majority was of course the major group then. A handful would support Amir al-Mu'mineen. And so these are the types of poems that, like I said, where Aqidah was defined and the path of Iman was paved, and people were sort of placed in which groups they were in. And sometimes without even expressing verbally outright who you belong to, the Bani Abbasis, the Bani Umayyads would ask the poets, write a fresh poem for me and recite it, knowing full well that their poems would never lack some form of aqidah or theology or a tribute to who they believed in. Their khulafa, their imams, the Ahl Bayt, whatever the case may be.
right.
So poetry was really a sort of a, it was really a tablighi mission back then.
Right.
And it has remnants of that today as well. Yeah.
So, right. And that's key, because it looks like they were using that poetry as a means to kind of grow the faith, where it was kind of dead after the Prophet because of what happened. And so that kind of, again, another good segue to our next question in regards to growth of English poetry today. Growing up in the South Asian community or any community, I would say, even say Arab community, Iranian community, growing up and listening to lectures in our mother tongue, whether it's Arabic, Farsi, or Urdu, we never thought lectures would be in English and it would grow to this level, exponentially. Mashallah, you are one of those speakers, amongst many around the entire world, who are, speaking in English. And I would say, like, we always mention here on this podcast is that, because it's in Urdu or another language other than English, it automatically is more emotional than English because it's in another language. That's not the case. I think that's been proven throughout years that it doesn't matter what the language is. Every language has its own beauty, and every language, mashallah, hits the heart because it's of who we're talking about. And so we've seen that growth of English lectures, and forget our parents' generation. We thought this generation wouldn't see it. Now, alhamdulillah, we have. And mashallah, you've been part of that growth. So, since we've seen the lectures in English grow throughout the years, how do you think that growth can happen in English poetry specifically as well? Like, what have you seen in the lecture circuit when it comes to English, and how do you think that can apply to poetry in English as well?
Yeah. It's a great question. And again, I'm trying to keep my answers not so long-winded, but
No, it's okay.
I
I think
apologize.
we're learning so much, like that revite you just heard about that woman reciting poetry at the grave of Rasulullah. I know that's new for me. I think that
Yeah,
might be new,
yeah, it
Naqi,
was,
for you and for other
Yeah.
viewers. So this is great information.
yeah, yeah. So, I'll tell you, there's one of the biggest differences, and you have to look at the language being used, Abbas. It's important to know that, for example, you're trying to cut something and you have two knives, one is dull and one is sharp, and it will always be dull no matter how hard you try to keep it sharp. The sharp one will always be sharp no matter how it just cuts different, right? So these three languages, Arabic, Farsi, and Urdu, they're based on emotion. They're deeper. It's just a reality of it. They
Right.
have, they describe, specific things, whereas English groups everybody into one area. And so it's just it's a different language altogether to write poetry in. And it's deeper. There's emotion tied to it. There's meaning behind it. Whereas English doesn't quite have that depth. And I'm not talking about the reciter of that language. Just the language itself doesn't have that depth. So that's
Right.
point number one. Point number two also, and I have a few points about this one specifically, is that when you trace it all the way back, in the Hawza Ilmi of Najaf and Qum, they would study the poems of the Imams. Imam Ali was known as a great poet. Sayyidah Fatima Zahra Salamullah Alayha was a great poet. Imam Sajjad, Imam Hadi, known to be poets. And then when you begin to get into Ghaibat al-Sughra, Ghaibat al-Kubra, then you have the ulama who would take on this skill. Imam Khomeini, for example, Rahmatullah Alayh, has a whole divana, a whole collection of poems that is published in the bazaars in Qum. Even when you look at his writings, they're very poetic in their writing. Even in the way that, for example, today Aitul Jawadi Amali, may Allah give him a long life, the way he speaks is poetic. He's able to actually, bring words together, even rhyme sometimes. It's pretty incredible. And so that culture of mixing the member and the scholar on the member with the art of poetry combined was always there. Okay. So a scholar's presentation back then, and let's move away from the Imam's times in Ghaibat al-Sughra, Ghaibat al-Kubra, when now the ulama on the member, it would be almost wajib upon them. It's not, of course, wajib, but almost lazmi. It's necessary for them to get their point across through verses, of course, through ahadith, and then, of course, through some lines of poetry. Quoting, Hafiz, or quoting Sa'ad, or quoting Rumi, or quoting, Mir Anis, or Iqbal, or et cetera, right? You pick up, for example, Ayatollah Khamenei's lecture sometimes. He's quoting, Allama Iqbal sometimes. He's quoting this person and that person. And that fusion, that sort of coming of the two worlds on the member was very common in these three cultures. That didn't happen in our culture in English. I know when I prepare for my lectures, I'm looking to really fortify my point and bring my point home through multiple verses of the Quran and multiple ahadith. My mind doesn't even go towards the fact that if I just put a poem in there or a line of poem in there, it really sort of brings the point home. But very much so, if you look at the experience of an Urdu speech or even in a Farsi speech, the point really sort of hits the hearts of the audience when, yes, the Quran is presented, the ahadith are presented, and then what bridges those two together sometimes is one line of a beautiful poem from this poet or that poet. That construction of a speech just doesn't exist in the English language. So we're talking about two different cultures, and I think that crossover is going to take a little bit of a while to do so. Now, my third point is that it helps when the alim himself is a poet, and some ulama, mashallah, are poets, and they are passionate about their poetry. And that helps. And then the final point is that, where the impact of the poet lies is in the character of the poet, him or herself. The verses, again, I'll go back to those verses, and I ask you guys as poets, go back to Surah Shu'ara, last 4 or 5 verses of those verses. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, look, if you don't have iman, amal salih, and dhikr of Allah, these 3 things, then you might fall into the category of those poets where the unfaithful and the misguided follow you around. You might be somebody who just allows their thought to go here, go there. There's no accountability. There's no fear of God. Whatever sounds good, whatever might get the best reaction, you'll write, whether or not it's accurate, whether or not it makes sense, whatever the case may be. Or God forbid, we become hypocritical. We write about those things. We ask those things. We present those things that we don't do ourselves. The last verse says that these are people who do dhikr of Allah kathiran. Now, dhikr comes in various forms, right? There's dhikr lisani, dhikr qalbi, dhikr amali, dhikr fikri. The remembrance of Allah first of all comes out of your tongue, right? La ilaha illallah, right? So right away, someone who is a poet should stop and think, can this same tongue now profess the unity of God, the beauty of his prophethood, the isma and the fadail and distinction of the Ahlul Bayt? That same tongue now, God forbid, uses itself for obscene language or raises its voice to disrespect members of their family, for example. Dhikr fikri, dhikr qalbi, dhikr amali, all these things, right? Does your heart remind you of Allah? Do your amal reflect the tawheed of Allah? These are the groups of poets that Allah says now, and again, we have our hadith that says those kind of poets, for each stanza they write, there's palaces waiting for them in the hereafter.
Wow.
But that condition is there. It can't just be that you put two words together and you rhyme them and that's it. Are you a manifestation of what you're writing on your paper, right? When the audience picks that up, okay, then that impact is there right away. They fall in love with the poet because they become someone who's not a hypocrite, and they fall in love with the art of poetry as well. And I find that to be growing, alhamdulillah, in a rapid rate. What you guys are doing is great work, and you're shedding light in an area that's Islamic, no doubt. Where your success lies is how much of that will cause a self-revolution inside both of you and those poets that you bring on as guests in your podcast, right? Because again, strictly Quranic basis. These are not my thoughts. Allah says, dhikrullahu kathiran. These are poets that if they want to be successful in this world and the hereafter, and be grouped with those like Qumil ibn Ziyad and Farazdak and all these great poets of the Ahlul Bayt, it has to seep into their amal, into their tongue, first of all, right? There's nothing worse than a poet sister talks about the beauty of salat, doesn't pray, the beauty of following Allah's sharia, for example, right? And he himself breaks that sharia. A person talks about patience and love and being soft and this and that, but they themselves don't exhibit those qualities. So it is very much it was always meant to be a revolutionary art, not just one that pleases the masses, right?
Right. Talk about action speaking louder than words.
Absolutely, right? And the Quran says, don't be like those that you say one thing, but you do another, right?
Right.
Yeah, and I guess following up from that last point there, you mentioned, scholars and lecturers in the East often use poetry to like drive that point home. And I think one of the beauties and power of poetry is that you're able to like convey a message in such a short format, whereas maybe it might take several lectures to convey that same thing. And you're also mentioning, poets need to be at the level of knowledge and faith, where whatever they're saying, they're also implementing that in their own lives, and then whatever they're implementing is essentially manifesting in their poems to be able to elevate their poetry to that level where it does drive the point home. And inshallah, I pray, that we produce an Iqbal or a Rumi or a Anis in the English language as well, where we could have that. I guess like what is the relationship between poets and lecturers? We see oftentimes, a lecturer reciting poetry, a poet deriving inspiration from lectures. And then oftentimes we also see that there's a lot of common language being used, whether it's in Masaib or Fadail, that's being used in poetry as well, right? To create this common verbiage, these connotations that exist within us, like Eastern languages for sure right now, but they don't necessarily exist in English. Should there be a lot like more that we could do between poets and lecturers, both in terms of like benefiting from each other, in terms of like poetry from the lecturers or knowledge for the poets, but also creating this like word bank or this common verbiage that we're all kind of commonly using to create that same culture that already exists in Eastern languages in English.
Again, you guys brought your A game, man. These are great questions, and I appreciate that. It's a process that I wish was already there. I know that sometimes when I hear both of your poems and your poetry, believe it or not, but sometimes it helps me to verbalize my masaib or my fadail, for example. Now, I see myself, and I talk about myself. I don't know about anybody. I see myself. I would love it if I could, include, let's say, a couple of stanzas. Let's say, for example, in between my speech, or even at the height of Masayib, where the crowd wants to cry, and then because sometimes a couplet just hits a little bit harder the heart than it does, let's say, for example, a description of an event, right? It's just it's a new culture, Naqi, right?
Mm-hmm.
And your your fear as a speaker is that maybe the crowd's like, this guy's just trying to create a culture that just simply isn't there, right? Um, but both of you coming from an Urdu background, that sometimes in Masaib, especially, when that alim chooses that beautiful stanza that talks about Abu Fazl Abbas, for example, after describing everything he went through, and then he places that in very beautifully, and it's a skill, right? It's an art. I mean, there's khitabat, there's eulogy, there's all these things that are skill, oration, and then
Yeah.
the crowd just erupts to a whole different level of musibah. So that fusion I talked about before, again, isn't quite there between the member and the microphone. Do I think we're there yet? I don't think we're there yet.
We're not. We're
um
not.
we're not, yeah. Only, again, there is this I think sometimes, not a fear, but like, I know people have asked me, you're the way you recite Masaib, you're just mimicking the Urdu culture.
Hmm.
And not in an insulting way, but that's just how you recite Masaib, and they're accurate because it's the only way I've ever heard Masaib being read. Um,
Right.
I could go down the tune route where we have that. Let's say, for example, the individuals who recite Masaib in the Persian culture, and a lot of my colleagues in the Hausa have adopted that culture as well. So you can see that we're trying to figure out a way to sort of mention this and present it in a way that is unique to the English culture, but still has a little bit of a remnants to that culture as well. Part of the thing that I would love to see is that perfect stanza, that perfect couplet that just might fit right there at that moment. But the hesitation sometimes lies in the fact that the people listening to it are expecting a certain culture given to them.
Hmm.
What I mean by culture is a certain set of rules of presentation, and they're not either ready for it, or perhaps we don't have that confidence in the fusion of these two, meaning the poem and the alim, let's say, for example, to present that. If that's really an answer, but we're a little bit away from that right now. I'm hoping one day it'll happen. But I think that this respect and this presentation of English poetry has been incredible. I know that sometimes when we hold events in our local centers, when it comes to mic nights or open mic nights, we now have elders coming and really encouraging that, and not just because they're invited, but because they generally enjoyed the poetry.
And elder poets too, like poets from a different, not just the elders, but the actual poets themselves from that
Yes,
language
yes, yeah.
come and support the English, which is
Right,
very
exactly.
encouraging. Yeah.
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 So those things were kind of unheard of 10, 15 years ago.
Yeah.
And I think that's really changing. And I would love to see one day, that sort of fusion happening, right? That because it is very much an Islamic traditional historical reality that the alim would present their matlab and content and their scholarly presentation at the same time that also include either their own poetry or, like I said, quote, different poets. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And sometimes I think that we're figuring that out, because the thing is with Urdu and Iranian culture, and most likely Arab culture as well, like the poetry is it's very rhyme, meter, and weight driven. And so when you present a stanza with weight and rhythm and flow, it sounds easier. Whereas English, it's kind of more of a spoken word free verse type of thing. So to kind of put in a spoken word free verse at that conjecture, at that point in time, might not hit as hard as something that has flow in it. So
Right.
that's something that we're kind of
Because
juggling.
that rhyme and meter you talk about, Abbas, that's a lot easier to present at that
Yeah.
moment,
Right.
because it's flowing, and you can see what the last, literally sometimes the crowd will finish that poem off for you because they can figure out, okay, this is the rhyme, this is the weight, and this is the flow, this is the rhyming word at the end, for example. And then
Right.
when it becomes a collective presentation from the crowd and from the member. And I don't know if that would have the same impact in English. I just don't
Yeah.
know. I don't know.
I mean, it's okay if it doesn't too. We could create our own culture as well, but we got to see that's a work in
Yeah,
progress.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
so mashallah, throughout this conversation, and we're kind of approaching the end a little bit here. Mashallah, you've had a lot of messages to give, a lot of hadith, a lot of Quranic ayat. And we kind of wanted to see if there's any other message to the poetry community or any other up and coming poets or any poets that are writing, any sort of message you have for them, any sort of advice that you haven't mentioned already. If you've kind of hit your limit in regards to any sort of advice that you've already given, then that's fine. You don't have to answer this question. But if there is anything left that you might say that, you know what, oh, I should say this point, this could be the right time to say it.
Yeah, no, I think I've made my point. It's just be responsible. Understand the impact of the pen that you have. If you're going to take on this act and you're going to publicize it and you're going to, make it available for everyone to read, then make sure it's in line with the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the Ahlul Bayt. And then more importantly is that, make sure it impacts you before it impacts anybody else.
Hmm.
And like I said, we don't want to fall into that category of poets the Quran talks about, where they're hypocritical in nature, they're careless with their pens, they're misguiding the masses, they're pulling them away from the scholars and the maraji and those principles of faith, for example, right? Comparing, for example, a wajib hajj to Imam Hussein ziyarah, for example, removing the wujub and the obligation of salat, for example. Those things that, of course, those are obvious, clear examples, but just understand you have an opportunity, really, when you're on the mic or when you post or when you could pull somebody towards a certain path. You could brighten that day that person is having a tough time, renew an allegiance, strengthen an existing faith, all that through your poetry. And I think sometimes, I think the poet loses sight of the fact that every word they write, they should be accountable for it, right? That's all.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I've said a lot already, so I'll keep that down. Yeah.
I wanted to thank you, Syed Asad, for all the advice and the words of wisdom. It's a lot to take back and think about, inshallah. And we have a tradition where we end our podcast usually with the poet reciting their own poem. And I hear that you also have written a poem for us for today. So we would love to hear that from you before closing off.
Yeah, I mean, I don't. I mean, you two are the poets, mashallah, and you guys write incredible poetry. And one thing I want to mention, Abbas, you mentioned the rhyme, the weight, and the
Meter.
flow. You said,
yeah, flow meter. Yeah.
Yeah, the flow meter. I really, maybe I'm a little bit old school, but I really like when both of you, and I've heard you guys write your poems like that sometimes, and sometimes it's sort of a free for all, but sometimes, I really prefer that form. Not that anyone's asking me what I prefer, but I prefer that form over anything else. Just because, number one, it's presented and the oration behind it, especially both of you guys present your poems very strongly, and you take your audience on a path. And when you have that sort of weight in that rhyme, I think it's beautiful. The poem I have is a very old one that I remember I had written during one of our camp visits years and years ago, when everybody was asked to write a poem, and I had written it, and it's just about me and God, and the forgiveness of God and His mercy, and my my refusal to learn my own lesson, and blah blah blah. And I feel like those poets that say, "Oh, I have nothing prepared," but it's right here, bookmarked on my phone.
You have your book inside your
I
abba.
was like, yeah,
Yeah.
I didn't bring anything. I just kind of flip the pages, even though there's a big
Yeah.
yellow tab in the book. Yeah, yeah. So
Page
Bismillah.
134.
page 134. So I'm really sorry. You two are the poets. I don't want to insult you.
Bismillah. Please don't
I
apologize.
apologize.
Bismillah.
It's
Looking
nothing
forward
really.
to it.
It's nothing really. But khair.
No, please. Bismillah. Looking forward to it.
Bismillah.
Oh my goodness. Okay. I don't know. I can't believe I'm doing this. All right. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Okay. It never ceases to amaze me or faze me how you blaze the trails for me of my own deceit. forever committed to those who have been acquitted of their sins by you. One embrace from your mercy, and we forget the taste of disgrace left upon our face. For we are responsible for our own oppression, leading us to confession, while all the while we hope tried to cope while grasping the scope of our actions.
Mm.
How could I forget you and let you be a second thought if only I fought the urge to merge with Shaitan the accursed? You are Allah. No words can describe or prescribe the essence that is you. You create with no prior, elevate clay over fire, separate the truth from the liar. Free the mu'min from the dire state that he's in. I became heedless of you, convincing myself that I'm needless of you. My arrogance controlled me while my desires patrolled me. And in this fight, I was right to take flight to your might and realize that without you, I am but a kite without strings, a bird without wings. So I cling to the one thing that I bring to my mind, and that is you, the greatest forgiver of all time. I continue to be enslaved by my desire, building my place in the hellfire, while all the while I beg for your forgiveness. This game has to end. To believe and then deceive, deceive and then believe is nothing but a game I play every day with you. And I fear one day you will say to you, I fear one day you will say that you no longer belong to me, while all the while I long for thee. Confessing my inability to fight my demons that are screaming for me to ignore you, while all the while I adore you. So I turn to you, Allah, looking to fix this flaw of my iman on a seesaw. Up and down it goes, calling on you only when those elements of this dunya look to destroy me. And when my life is free of despair, I resume my satanic affair, almost as if I placed a sign on thee that reads only use when necessary. So that was just a small attempt, and
Subhanallah.
I apologize to you guys for that.
That was amazing.
I hope it wasn't an insult to you
That
guys.
was phenomenal.
Phenomenal.
You know how you said before, I don't have anything prepared. I'm not one of those guys. He's one of those guys. I'm not really a poet. You guys are the real poet, and then he slams us with that.
Well,
No, I'm not a
just
poet at
fully.
all. No, no, no.
Mashallah, that was really, really amazing. I appreciated that so much. Hoping to hear more from you, as Sayyid Asad.
Yeah.
Inshallah, I'll let you guys do what you do best, and that's it. But yeah, no, I wanted to thank you guys. Really, this was a great experience, a wonderful conversation, and I like what you're doing. I think that it's important that we do revive these historic arts that have always and we're always supposed to be avenues towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So I appreciate that. I really pray for your success in this endeavor, inshallah.
Inshallah. And as you mentioned during your points that, making that culture between the scholar and the poet that they did in our previous cultures, hopefully we kind of maybe started something here. It's kind of bridging that gap between the poet and the scholar in this culture, and who knows, it might grow into something more beautiful in the future. So just formally, on behalf of the Poets of the Household podcast, myself and Naqi, we just want to thank you for being with us here today and taking time out of your very busy schedule again for being with us here today.
No, thank you very much to both of you, Naqi and Abbas. I appreciate it. And again, may Allah accept your efforts, inshallah, and may these efforts be avenues of self-revolution for all of us, inshallah, and for those outside of us, inshallah, as well.
Inshallah. Again, viewers, thank you so much for being with us here today. Again, like I mentioned, this was going to be a very special episode, and it did not disappoint. Alhamdulillah, I learned a lot. Naqi, I'm sure you did, and I'm sure a lot of our viewers and listeners did as well today. So this has been episode 5 of the Poets of the Household podcast. Thank you so much for being with us here today. Until next time, wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.